Good afternoon, everyone. I am Tani Mata, the Executive Director of the UC Davis Coastal and Marine Sciences Institute. I want to thank everybody for being here in this time of Zoom fatigue. This is a really important conversation and I appreciate you making time for it in your day. We created this climate justice seminar series to give scientists an opportunity to think deeply about their role in the climate justice movement. And so with that, I just want to remind everybody that you can put your questions down in the question and answer box at the bottom. Questions submitted through chat will not be answered, so make sure to direct all your questions to that question and answer box. We will also be recording this presentation and have it available for viewing on our website for those folks who couldn't join us. And so with that, I'd like to turn it over to PhD candidate Karina Fish to get us started.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for tuning in today. As Tani said, my name is Karina Fish, and I have the pleasure of introducing today both Dr. Whiteman and Dr. Ali. We'll start with Dr. Whiteman first. Liz is the Executive Director of the California Ocean Science Trust, which is a nonprofit organization dedicated to accelerating the progress toward a healthy and productive ocean for California. Created by state legislation, OST bridges the gap between cutting-edge scientific research and sound ocean management. Liz leads a team of with science, policy, and management expertise to bring diverse perspectives together and to foster innovative approaches to difficult problems. OST serves as the science advisory to the California Ocean Protection Council, and Liz co-chairs the OPC Science Advisory Team. Liz has over a decade of experience working at the Science Policy Interface in California on topics ranging from marine protected areas to sea level rise and ocean acidification. Trained as a marine ecologist in the UK, Liz also spent a decade in the Caribbean promoting science-informed decisions for fisheries and protected management areas. So please help me welcome Dr. Whiteman. And Dr. Ali is the Vice President for the Environmental Justice, Climate, and Community Revitalization at the National Wildlife Federation. He's also the founder and CEO of Revitalization Strategies. He previously worked at the U.S. Environmental Protected Agency for 24 years. At the EPA, Dr. Ali served as the Assistant Associate Administrator for Environmental Justice and was a Senior Advisor for the Environmental Justice and Community Revitalization. At the EPA, he also led the Interagency Working Group on Environmental Justice, which comprised of 17 environmental agencies and White House offices focused on implementing holistic strategies to address the issues facing vulnerable communities. Dr. Ali served as the Director of Communications in the EPA's Office of Environmental Justice, where he led the Communications and Stakeholder Involvement team. And in 2010, Dr. Ali served as the Environmental Justice Lead for the BP Deepwater Horizon oil spill. He's trained thousands across the country in the fundamentals of environmental justice and was recognized for this work as he was selected by EPA's National Enforcement Training Institute as the Trainer of the Year. Please help me in welcoming both Dr. Ali and Dr. Whiteman for today's session. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much, Karina, for the invitation to be here today. And Dr. Ali, it's my pleasure to spend the next hour in conversation with you. To get us started, I'm sure it's probably fair to say that most of us have either heard or used the term environmental justice, more so in the last couple of years than probably at any point prior. So to set the scene, if you like, I wonder if you might share what does environmental justice mean to you broadly, but also in the context of coastal and ocean policy?
You know, to me, environmental justice has lots of meanings because it depends if we're talking about environmental justice or environmental injustice, because there are two sides to the coin. The environmental injustice side is dealing with those disproportionate impacts that continue to happen in communities of color, lower wealth white communities, and on indigenous lands. You know, it really is helping our most vulnerable communities move from surviving to thriving, if you will. Environmental justice is the other side of the coin, about how we help to revitalize those communities. How do we address the disinvestments that have happened inside of those communities? How do we make sure that the voices of communities are actually framing out our policies and our activities and making sure that they have the resources that they need to move forward on their vision. And then when we get into policy, that's when it gets really interesting, because sometimes we think that policy is this amorphous set of actions that there are no biases in, that there's never discrimination in, that systemic racism doesn't sometimes find its way into policy. And I like to use some of the history of our country to help to illuminate for folks that policy can be a positive, it can be transformative, or policy can also have some devastating effects. If we look at our indigenous brothers and sisters, policy drove the removal of them from their traditional lands. Policy also drove trying to strip culture away from them. There was intentionality in many of those actions. Policy actually played a role also for those of us who come from public health backgrounds in many of the diseases that they also had to deal with, because folks saw it as an opportunity to eliminate those nations and tribes. Policy played a role also in bringing Africans from the continent here to be enslaved and to use for free labor. So we know that policy has had its negative impacts, but it also, as I said before, can be transformative, especially when we take a holistic approach to the work that we do, whether in the oceans or on our coast or inland. It can be used to actually uplift folks.
So I'd like to spend some time on this concept of policy and its relationship to environmental justice. But before I get there, let's just learn a little bit more about you and your journey. Because unlike many of us for whom this is a new learning arena, you have a long and varied sort of career experience in environmental justice. So I'm wondering if you could tell us a little bit about one of your first maybe transformative experiences in environmental justice activism, or what it was that got you started on this pathway.
Well, you know, I come out of a faith-based family. So in my family, our parents, grandparents never told us what we had to do, but said that we do have to, whatever it is, we have to find a way to give back. And I was thinking about this question as you ask it. You know, my transformation goes all the way back to sitting at my grandfather's knee as he was having conversations around civil rights and workers' rights. He actually worked in the coal mines. He was actually, one of those persons who was involved with the unions. And I remember as a small boy, I guess it was his way of conditioning me. He had a bushel of apples and he used to cut them. And I loved apples. And he would cut off a little piece as he was speaking to the folks who would come from across the county. As they would have meetings. And then I start to think further down with my father and the work that he did around workers' rights. And then, God places us where we're supposed to be. And I remember one of the first meetings that I ever went to, which was in Louisiana. And there was an elderly African-American woman who was there. And this was one of the early gatherings of people. And I remember her sharing the stories that were going on. And I was one of the few young people in the room. And I remember her leaning over to me and she asked, "Am I Mustafa?" And I said, "Yes, ma'am." And she said, "I want you to remember what you're hearing and seeing today so that your work will always have authenticity in it, because you will anchor it in the realities of what people are dealing with on the ground." And I remember those voices and those whispers and those hugs from all of those folks who are dealing with issues 24 hours a day. And I also remember looking in their eyes and seeing that hope and optimism, even in the face of such amazing sets of odds. So for me, it goes back to the early days of those mentors and those sets of experiences that kind of frame you out when you're young. When you see it when you're young and you know that there are folks who've been, fighting for different issues for decades upon decades and didn't give up. It plants a seed in you.
So we've already touched on some really important topics of spirituality and its role here. So we'll come back to that one definitely. But let's talk about policy. Let's take you back in time, if you like, to your early days of your career at the Environmental Protection Agency. Where you started while you were a student. And I'm sure there's probably lots of students on the call today So I'm wondering if you could share a little bit about how you, at that stage in your career, elevated issues of environmental justice and the tools and techniques you employed that ended up being so successful that you not only became a founding member of the EPA's Office of Environmental Justice, but also eventually then led the interagency working group on environmental justice.
Well, I never take credit for all of the work that I've done over the years. I give it all back to those amazing frontline leaders who invested in me, who mentored me, protected me, uplifted me. And the one skill that I think is so incredibly important is to be able to actively listen to folks about what their visions are, what their needs are, and what their sets of expectations are. And all I and others did, because it wasn't just me, there were so many other incredible folks who are working inside the government and outside, that we began to frame out those recommendations that folks were giving, and to find ways of navigating the bureaucracy that is the federal government or state governments, or even our own institutions have their own bureaucracy. And then to say, well, what are the foundational elements that folks are asking for, right? So we knew, because I started before we founded the office, that there needed to be a central place in the government. That came out of recommendations from the Michigan Working Group in the late 80s and the early 90s. So we began that. And then folks said, well, we need some resources to be able to start to get some to be able to authenticate what folks are experiencing on the ground. So we created the Environmental Justice Small Grants Program, which has now reached over 1,600 communities and provide millions of dollars. And then folks said, well, we need a way to bring business and industry to the table, along with state and local government, so forth and so on. So I say all that to say that if we want to be effective in our work, then we have to truly listen and engage with communities, and then figure out, based upon where we sit in whatever organization it is, how can we make that become a reality? And then to always be honest with folks, which is, I don't know why it's so tough for folks to just be honest with people, and to say, these are some of the things we can move forward on now. These are some of the things that are sort of more midterm goals. These are some of the things that are going to be really difficult. And we'll have to put together, a set of strategies of how to make that happen. So to answer your question, and I apologize for giving you so much in that space, but one is to listen, two is to be authentic, and three is to raise up the voices of communities and other frontline organizations and leaders.
That's wonderful. Thank you. And just on that note of being honest about decision making and what goes into decisions, a lot of us do a lot of learning through our science careers as to the appropriate role of science in decision making. And so for the many scientists that are likely on this call today and hearing this conversation, we know that it isn't the only thing that needs to inform just policy and just actions. So I'm wondering if you might share some lessons you learned in your experiences at EPA about how just policy is in fact crafted, negotiated, implemented, or if there's particular barriers that commonly thwart just policies from being enacted.
Yeah, well, let me just say for the record that I am a science wonk, always have been, and so much appreciate that we are in a moment where science is being honored once again and valued. And we won't get into any political conversations about folks who maybe did not value science. Over the years, what I learned was that there are various forms of science, right? There's the science that we are taught, coming up through school, and then when we go through college and grad school and those types of things. And there is also as valuable science that comes from a traditional environmental knowledge. And there is value in the science that comes from community-based participatory research and other forms of community science. And then thinking critically, and we all understand how we have to QA, QC everything and have these various protocols in place. I get that. But we also have to think about how do we honor all these various forms of knowledge that exist, in the science world, because we understand science is a foundational piece, at least at the EPA, it is a law and science, and we have evolved into also making sure that communities are valued in that policy sets of conversations. So how do we get our own game together on the science side and then bring that information to the policy making? And how do we also make sure that our policy making is anchored in what is actually happening on the ground in communities? Let me give you a quick example. In the early days of the environmental justice movement, one of the things that folks used to slow down the process or to discredit what folks were saying they were experiencing on the ground was the lack of research, right? From the traditional models that we all have worked from. So there's nothing more frustrating for a community to say, well, you know, before said entity moved into this area, we did not have these rare forms of cancer. We did not have these high levels of asthma. We did not have these liver and kidney diseases to the level that we did. So they knew, based upon their own scientific set of processes, that there was something that wasn't right and that something changed when something moved into their community. So we had to go through a process of figuring out how to merge and ground truth, but at the same time get the hard science in place. When you can do that, then you can move into that policy realm. Why is that important? Because now you have a set of advocates who will also back up, because most scientists are not out there as activists, right? That's not necessarily your job, but there's nothing wrong with it if you do it. I want to make sure I'm clear, because I work with all kinds of scientists, and some have definitely, you know, become champions. They can do the hard work, but they also say, you know what, I'm right there with you. But those are just some of those pieces. You know, I sit on the board of the Union of Concerned Scientists and a couple of other organizations, and it's wonderful to see scientists being willing to expand and to explore, which is a part of being a scientist, looking for the solutions to the problems that are there. So for me, that policy set comes after we do the hard work that is necessary, and then we have a stronger foundation to stand on.
So let's stick with this thread for a moment, because I think this is important advice for our science community who is willing to expand and to think about new forms of knowledge and new forms of engagement. And you know, what I think many of us experience barriers with is that so many environmental justice issues are community scale problems that are being tackled by local organizers who are trusted members of the community. So what role, or how can a scientist engage productively when it takes time to sort of become entrusted as somebody that for whom that knowledge will be shared, and often there isn't the ability to spend years and years in a community in order to build those relationships. What advice would you offer the academic community in that circumstance?
Well, there's some consistency there, right? We know what a healthy relationship looks like. We have them hopefully in our own lives, whether it's partner to partner, husband to wife, boyfriend to girlfriend, friend to friend. You know, there's honesty that's there. There's also a support that is there. There's also active communication. You know, I've worked in, oh good gracious, over 700 communities now. And even some of the early first sets of communities I've worked in, I still reach back from time to time and just say, hey, how you doing? What's going on? Is there anything I can do to be helpful? Is there anybody I can link you up with? So, you know, when we ask the question, you know, what can scientists be doing now? I mean, God has blessed scientists with just some amazing skill sets, right? We all get different, wonderful skill sets. We just got to recognize and then figure out how to use them. So, you know, there are so many frontline organizations and other communities that can use your help sometimes in understanding some more technical information, in being able to figure out, you know, we're thinking about putting this protocol together or whatever it might be. What are some of the steps we need to do so that that information will be honored and valued? who do we need to talk to that you might know at a local academic institution, a college or a university that can work with us on this? So there's all these things that we can do. Yes, we're all busy. We all have a number of different priorities. For some folks, I got to meet this grant. So I got to do, I got to do X, Y, and Z. Or my dean is saying that, I got to get this done. And how does this play into that larger thing that the dean says is necessary, or whomever your hierarchy is? But there's all something that we can do. And scientists are so critically needed in this moment, because let's look at, we know that there are these immediate impacts that are happening in communities of color and lower wealth communities on indigenous lands. But we also know these impacts that are both in the moment and even greater sets of impacts that are coming from the climate crisis. So we need scientists to also help us to understand how to navigate both the immediacy of the moment and these future sets of challenges. So I say all that to say, now's the time just to reach out, in this Zoom moment, and we're all zoomed out, right? But, it's so much easier for folks now to be able to kind of, dip in for a second and listen, and just put something in the chat and say, hey, I'm Dr. So-and-so, or I'm Mr. or Mrs. X, Y, and Z, just to let folks know that you were there, that you cared enough to spend a few moments with time. And then if you are inclined to, and say, here's my contact information, if you guys have some questions about some of the things that were being shared, or if there's somebody, else who I can link you up with, that doesn't take a whole lot. And that's how we start to build real authentic relationships. And after we get to the authentic relationships, then we get to the authentic collaborative partnerships or relationships, which takes even a little bit more work. But it's all just about connecting, letting people know that you see them, that you hear them, that you respect them, that you honor them, and that you're there to help. And I think we have a responsibility, any of us who have been blessed with privilege, we have a responsibility to just figure out how to give back. Some people it's going to be a little bit, some people it's going to be a lot, but every little bit helps.
So I hear taking a start, reaching out to start those steps towards building a relationship is something scientists can do. Let's also change tack a little bit to think about arts community alongside scientists. You were a senior vice president at the Hip Hop Caucus. So I'm wondering if you could sort of bring some of those themes in, of the ways in which art and culture can communicate principles of environmental justice that perhaps science and policy can't, or there's barriers to.
Well, and folks can hashtag this. We can make science sexy, right? We really can. We have to make science available. We have to make science to the degree translatable and transparent, which is not always easy in some of the various forms and fashions that folks work. Working at the Hip Hop Caucus was such a blessing. I come from a musical background. I come from an arts background as well. And think about how art, how music, how all the various forms that are in there can actually lower the barriers that often exist between people. It gives you an opportunity to share information in a way that is non-threatening, that is non-partisan, that is all these things that we use to separate each other. And I use this example. I probably know 100 of the top scientists, around the planet that I've had the opportunity to engage with or listen to and learn from, those different types of things. All of us, have been blessed in that space. And sometimes the information that scientists will initially share is so far above where most people are. That's not always the case, because I've seen some folks who can break it down. But I think about, when we dealt with some of the hurricanes, and I was blessed and, to know many of the entertainers. And I often used to tease folks. I said, we can get 100 of the best scientists here on this stage, and people will remember about 10% of what you say, right? And I said, I can bring Beyonce, and Beyonce can say something, and all of a sudden people will pick up their phone They'll start tweeting and gramming and all these other types of things. And then I said, wouldn't it be creative if we took, artists and entertainers and began to train them on the basics around the things, right? Because they never wanted to be well, maybe they did want to be a biologist or wanted to be someone who worked in the nuclear space or all these other types of things. And then once folks then got that basic information, they said, you know what, I want more. And then we bring in the scientists who, are really grounded in the work. And we begin to build these bridges between folks. And we begin to expand the basis of folks who have, a working knowledge, and then folks who have sort of a secondary set of knowledge, and so forth and so on. And at the Hip Hop Caucus, we were able to begin to do some of that transformative work. And we began to use, there's incredible stuff. So I'll just give you a couple of examples. Folks can go look some of this up when you get a free second. So most folks know who Common is, right? Common, Grammy nominated singer or rapper, award-winning actor. Common began to get engaged around water quality issues. And we created this video called Trouble in the Water, which actually talked about not only things that were going on in Flint, but a number of other, why water and the preservation of it and pollution impacts and so forth and so on. So that was taking science and bringing it into that media space. Or you can look at the work that the caucus won an MTV Music Award with Taboo from the Black Eyed Peas. Some folks, depending on how old you are, will remember the Black Eyed Peas. They still doing their thing. There you go. So Stand Up for Standing Rock, right? So really breaking down and bringing science into it about the impacts of pipelines on culture, on the possibility of water, impacts on water, so forth and so on. And there are numerous examples of how we can merge science with the arts. And that's just one example. There's so many other things we can do. So I know I could go on and on about the power of this, but I'm looking forward to the day when science advisory committees come out with sets of reports, or even before they're coming out with them, and they say, how can we make sure the creatives are a part of this process so that we can reach a larger audience, and so that we can really begin to get people thinking critically about the role that they play in both these impacts and the sets of opportunities.
I hear a challenge being laid down here for us on this webinar today. Just sticking with this thread of finding the things that bring us together rather than separate us. I think one of the conversations we often shy away from as scientists is the role of spirituality and faith in our work. And you've referenced, you come from a faith-based family. And we noticed that, in environmental justice, the environment piece is often described as the places we live, work, and play. But on your website, you, and I think you've said it here, it's places where you live, work, play, and pray. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the role of spirituality and faith in your work.
Yeah, I mean, it's critical. If you think about all the challenges that not just myself, but others who do this work have faced, you better have belief in some type of a higher power, whether you want to say it was the Big Bang and something was created out of the Big Bang, or, that you believe in, some of the various names we use to describe God. Spirituality is, I want to say, throughout humanity, is a natural connection to the land. But I know for communities of color, for our indigenous brothers and sisters, there is no separation between the land, spirituality, the animals, the air we breathe, the water we drink, everything. If you look at traditional African cultures, the same thing. If you look at many of our Latinx communities, it's the same thing. And I would often say that for many of our white brothers and sisters also, even though sometimes we have lost a connection, if you look at where many folks come from outside of our country, there also was a spiritual connection at one time to the land. And then if you want to bring it forward, right? If you look at many of our religious practices, the water is a part of it, right? Our indigenous brothers and sisters have shared with us that water is life. If you look at in Christianity, baptism is so important. And at one time, and still in some locations where the water quality is good enough, people still get baptized in creeks and rivers. And we can go down the list of how there is a spiritual connection, right? And science is all about really, even though sometimes some of us will, if it's not verifiable, even though, when we look at black holes, when we look at a number of other theoretical concepts, that there is not necessarily the facts to prove it, but we do have strong leanings in that direction, that there is a universal aspect to spirituality and science, I would say. And I would love to have a deeper conversation one day about that. And for me, that all comes together in this work that we can do to help to make change happen.
Great, thank you for that. And I'll just note for the audience right now that I've got a couple more questions to ask of Dr. Ali, but please, in reminding you to, if you have questions, to please put them in the Q&A, and we'll turn to those in just a moment. But let's continue our journey forward. So we've talked about policy, we've talked about the Hip Hop Caucus, and now I'd love to just spend a moment about the National Wildlife Federation. And I'm wondering if you could draw from your experiences there about and describe how you see the role of large conservation organizations in the fight against environmental racism and towards environmental justice goals.
Sure. Just let me back up just a little bit, because when you brought up NWF, it just reminded me of something. Like throughout my career, and since there's so many students who are watching, there will be folks who tell you, don't do that because it won't be good for your career. Sometimes that will be true. I remember folks told me, don't work on environmental justice issues and social justice issues because you will destroy your future and your career. And then I remember when I left EPA and I went to the Hip Hop Caucus, folks said, don't do that. It doesn't make any sense. And then when I was getting ready to go to NWF and I was deciding between this foundation who wanted me to come work for them and NWF, half of my mentors said, don't do it. We had this big fight 30 years ago, and there was a letter that was written, talking about and truthfully talking about big conservation and environmental organizations and their lack of camaraderie at a minimum, and not actually focusing on the issues that were going on. And then there were others who said, we know that you like taking on big challenges. And if it's something you think you can actually do, then we'll support you. So all that to be said, the work that has to happen, both at these large environmental organizations, conservation organizations, climate organizations, scientific organizations, is critically important, but it has to be done under a rubric of authentic collaborative partnerships. And that means understanding that there is a power imbalance that exists, right? Many of our organizations, some are well-funded, some are funded, and that we have access and leverage. And those can be used to help to move a positive agenda forward if we build the right relationships, and if we are also building the prioritization of the issues that frontline communities are asking and are working on to make happen. I'll use NWF as an example. NWF has 6 million members. That's huge. And if you can begin to evolve those members into learning and then engaging and then moving that to sort of advocacy and activism. And if you only get 50%, you've got 3 million new folks helping to support the work that needs to happen. If you only get 10%, you still got 600,000 new folks working to be supportive. So I took all that into consideration when Colin O'Mara, a young president who sat down with me 5 times and said, Mustafa, I've heard you talk about creating 21st century organizations. That's what we want to do. And at that time, I was sitting on the board of NWF,
Mm.
and we unpacked what that needed to look like, and we began that journey, and knowing that it would take some work.
And so that speaks to the how these organizations are evolving, updating, and making most salient their mission-driven external work. But in addition to that, I'm wondering if you can speak to how you see, if you see, conservation organizations addressing their own histories of bias and injustice.
I'm so glad you asked that question because, you know, lots of times we'll look outside of our own organizations and say what everybody else should be doing, right? But we don't do the hard work of transforming our organization. So there are some basics, like people will, you know, invite me into certain spaces and I'll ask the question, what does your board look like? Who's sitting on your board? Then the next question is, what does your senior leadership look like? Who are they? Where do they come from? What's their sets of competencies that exist in that space? What's your middle management look like? And then we go into the strategic planning process. You know, where is environmental justice, climate justice, racial justice identified inside of that? What's your training plan, or what trainings have gone on? So, you know, those are just some of the basics that tell you if you are even serious about entering into the space. Because if we don't fix our own houses, right, then it's really difficult for us to be able to show up in an authentic way. And that can be an ongoing process, but there has to be intentionality, right, of making sure change happens. It's scary for some folks. Here's why it's scary, because we're actually talking about authentically sharing power and authentically sharing resources. And those resources can look in lots of different ways. But we know in our country, those are also two of the main drivers of almost everything that has gone on in our country, right? When we snatch land from people, it's about power, it's about money. You know, when we have put laws in place and policies in place to stop folks from voting or doing a number of other things, it has been about holding on to what we have perceived. Let me say that again for folks, that we have perceived as the pie being this big, and that if we do anything, you're going to lose your slice. That's an old 20th century sort of paradigm to operate from. If we truly see new sets of opportunities, then we see the expansion of the pie. And that is, you know, not a whole lot of things that we're ever taught in business school. And I can go into a deeper set of conversations at another time about that. But I share all that to say that we have to be responsible for the change that happens, especially organizations that are not labeled as organizations of color. It's just like racism in our country. Black and brown and indigenous folks have been, you know, for hundreds of years now, focused on trying to deconstruct and dismantle that. And we know that they were not responsible for it. So in the same sense, our organizations have the ability, just like in general, white brothers and sisters have the ability to be helping to dismantle racism. We as organizations also have that same set of responsibility to begin to fix some of the unfortunate sets of gaps that we have left, and sometimes intentional and sometimes unintentional.
So I have to pick that up and ask one last question before turning it to an audience, because this advice is so important. But how would you translate it for the scientists working in research institutions and in academia? You know, much of which, particularly here in California, has been you know, built on prior injustices. How do individual scientists leverage their training towards either external looking environmental justice work or internal change in the systems and structures in which they work?
Well, you know, one begins with personal reflection, right? If we're talking about an individual, if we're talking about an organization, it is a reflection on the organization itself. It is reaching out and having tough conversations, both externally and internally. And it's okay. And stop and this is what I share with folks, whether I'm talking to corporations, it's a little trickier with corporations and everybody else who's in between. You're going to make some mistakes. If you build real relationships with folks, they'll give you the space because they'll know that your intentionality is one that's good and one that you are trying to evolve and grow. And I think that that's true even for folks who are scientists. Sometimes you may be moving into a new space that is a bit uncomfortable. If we're going to have real talk, you may be working with folks whom you've never worked with before for a number of different reasons. And that in itself can sometimes cause some hesitancy. But for scientists, for real scientists, right? You know what the IPCC has shared. You know what the National Climate Assessment has shared. We understand how quickly many of these very large sets of challenges are moving at us, better than many in the general public, right? We have a responsibility to get it together as quickly as possible. And that means that we've got to have a parallel set of work that's happening. We've got to be fixing ourselves, right? Our organizations, when I say ourselves. And we've got this other set of work that's happening at the same time, moving down the track of, we know new pandemics are coming. We know that the impacts that are happening from the climate emergency and a number of other things that will be happening. And that's why we have to move now. And we've got tools and resources now to actually do that where we didn't have before. Of course, science is always evolving. Technology is always evolving. And for the first time, and as long as I've been doing this work, and I know it takes a while for it to sometimes reach the ground, but we actually now have an administration that is actually identifying dollars to go with all of the ideas and visions that so many of us have said, if I just had this, I would be able to magnify the positive change. I would be able to spend a little more time with frontline organizations. I would spend a little more time in getting young people better engaged and supporting them in their journey and helping to build that capacity at an even younger age that some of us didn't get till we were 30 or 40 years old. So that's why I say this is a transformational moment. But in that transformational moment, we have to transform. We as organizations and as individuals have to step into that new space, if you will. It's almost like, I love astronomy. And, as telescopes get stronger and stronger and stronger, we begin to see new parts of the universe and new galaxies. We have to be willing to also, that's why we come into science, right? So many people come into science is because you want to, it's almost like Star Trek, brave new frontiers, right? So for some folks, this is a new frontier of being a scientist, maybe who spent their time in the lab, analyzing, doing what they do, and to now say, you know what, there's more to me. This is me, but there's also more that I want to do. I want to actually touch folks. I want to be there to see when we talk about 100,000 people dying prematurely from air pollution in our country every year, what is it that I can do to actually not only understand those emissions and how they're playing out on a public health way, but also how do I actually work with that community to make sure that they know each and every part of this process that is impacting them. That's powerful. And you get to, at the end of the day, I hope that when I close my eyes for the last time, that I hear the words, from whomever as I'm floating away. That I know I'm getting a little esoterical for folks, but that I did a good job and that I did all that I could in the moment that I had. And for me, I think that's the power of science, that we get to be transformative.
Sage advice. Thank you. I'd love to just turn it over to Karina for a moment to help in relaying any questions from our audience today.
Awesome. Thank you. Yeah, we have a couple of questions around the theme of folks feeling a little hopeless in their current position or a little bit restricted in the current position in terms of whether that's, not seeming too advocacy-like in a quote unquote objective position, or if they're a graduate student and they feel that they have less influence over the university and what the university dictates for academic responsibilities. The idea of having, smaller or less power in spaces that you'd like to change when you're cleaning your own house. Do you have any advice for folks who are trying to assess how best they can advance the progressive agenda with having more minimal, they're not the provost of the university per se?
Yeah, no, I feel you. Well, I often tell people, you have power unless you give it away, right? And that power comes in lots of different forms and fashions. So when we're students, we got to put the work in, right? And we got to do what we need to do to get through whatever your academic process is. But at the same time, we live in a different world, right? So if you went to graduate school 30 years ago, there wasn't the internet, there wasn't the ability to actually touch people through social media and make, various types of contacts and also get engaged in different types of movements. So I would say don't be hopeless in this moment. You're going to see so many changes over the next 3 years. You're going to have so many additional opportunities that, so many folks probably wouldn't have had for a decade or 2 decades later. There are folks that in your off time, and I know when you're a student, there ain't a whole lot of off time. And even when you're sometimes, a professor looking for tenure, you're always grinding it out. But you got an opportunity. There's so many different frontline organizations and stakeholders who can use your help. And I promise you, it will rejuvenate you knowing that, the work that you're doing is actually helping to make change happen. I think that the bureaucracies that exist inside of our organizations will slowly evolve. The academic evolution sometimes is the slowest evolution, even though we think it would be the fastest evolution. But I truly believe, because I've worked with so many different schools, that many of them are starting to place more value on these issues. When I first started working, EJ is an example, but EJ is not the only one. When I first started working on EJ, there was no academic institutions that were really focusing on these issues. There were very few studies, some of the early studies, the 87 study and a couple others. But now, you can get, doctoral degrees in many of these types of issues that we're talking about. There's strong master's programs. And, there are those who are authentically trying to do the work in the academic space to make sure that folks are okay. So all that to say, hang in there. There's resources, there's opportunity, and you just have to enter that space in an authentic way.
Great, thank you so much. I think one of the follow-up questions to that was, how do you stay motivated, or how do you stay hopeful in times where it seems like it's overwhelmingly negative? I think you touched on it a little bit earlier about your spirituality aspect of things. So I think if you have anything more to add to that answer about how you stay hopeful in dark times.
I wouldn't be human if I didn't get disappointed, if I didn't get tired. That is just a part of, our physiology. But, I want everybody to just take a moment. I want you to think about if you lived in a community that was surrounded by petrochemical facilities or an incinerator, or folks who lived in Flint and the thousands of other locations that have higher levels of lead in their water, whatever the situation might be. You might be living next to a certified animal feeding operation. Those folks, our folks, that is their experience 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year, and they still fight. They still look for innovative ways of addressing their issues, and they never give up. And I think about when I get tired, I'm like, well, yeah, it's okay to be tired because it is a physical reaction. But on the other side of that is that you can't give up. These folks don't give up. So how can we give up? If you're arguing with your dean because you want to be able to do some work in this space, don't give up. Because sometimes you got to come back a few times, and sometimes you got to refine your proposal. Sometimes you got to have built some additional partnerships. Sometimes you got to say, okay, and this foundation is going to do some work in this space so we can get a grant, you can't give up, because folks need everyone in this set of fights around both on the environmental side and the climate side. And we have a responsibility, right? You know, that old adage, am I my brother and my sister's keeper, right? Is it real for you? Because if it's real for you, then that means that you won't give up. You can get tired, but you don't give up.
Great, thank you. And the last question is around, you mentioned there are some scientists that you've interacted with who are very much engaged with and on the ground with communities who are trying to enact change. Are there some commonalities you've seen as through lines that have merely supported it, or you see as a common denominator in the way they operate? Or are there any innovative examples you'd like to highlight?
Well, I would say some of the common denominators are folks who are comfortable with themselves, but want to continue to grow and to connect with folks, right? So here's the funny thing. I'm an introvert by nature, right? I would be much rather be sitting someplace writing and reading and listening to others. The folks that I find who are most successful, you know, are those folks who are not afraid to go outside of what their comfort zone is and see it as a responsibility, as a part of their journey. Folks see through things, right? Folks know if you're showing up because you care, or if you're showing up for another reason. And, you know, that's the common thread. It's those folks who have touched and embraced their humanity and want to use their gifts and abilities and blessings to do more. And that's the commonality. And it doesn't matter. I talk to so many white brothers and sisters who are like, well, I'm not sure if I would be welcomed into this space. Okay, I get it. Think about all the spaces that folks of color were not welcomed in for a long time. And the reality of the situation is that you will be welcomed into many spaces if you're showing up as an authentic ally. So I would say don't be afraid, but do it in a respectful way. Do it in a way that you're listening. You know, in all the years that I was doing this work and continue to do this work, although it's a little bit more difficult now, I would go places before folks ever knew I was coming. And I would go and sit and listen. I would go to people's church services or other faith-based services. I would go to the barber shop, which I cannot do anymore. You know, I would go to community centers because I wanted to get a flavor for what was going on. I wanted to hear before you get into a formal setting where people think they have to say one thing. And all of that goes back to, you know, figuring out that it's not about you, right? No matter who you are, no matter how many degrees we have after our names, you know, it's about the folks. And they know if you're coming up because it's about the folks.
Great, well, thank you. I'll turn it back over to Dr. Whiteman for the last couple questions.
Thanks, Karina. Thanks for those questions. I'd actually like to pick up, so there was a couple of questions we weren't able to get to, but one of them spoke to, you know, what is a realistic vision of the future? You know, what given the changes in our climate and in our world. So I'd love to sort of pick up that thread and combine it with a question about, it's drawn from your LLC, the revitalization strategies, where you talk about the transition from surviving to thriving. So what does the transition look like from surviving to thriving? And then how do we know that we're getting there? You know, what does that future look like? What does success look like?
Well, we have two different possible futures. I lean more toward the optimistic side. So what do our two futures look like? If we don't get racial justice issues right, if we don't move to a positioning where we're willing to make the investments on the environmental and climate side, and from the paradigm I work with, you know, when I talk about environmental issues, I'm also talking about housing and transportation and public health and jobs, just so folks are clear. If we don't do that, we know what the future is going to look like. There's going to be more chaos. There's going to be more disparities in wealth, even larger gaps than we have. And we know throughout history, when there are environmental impacts, when there are these large gaps in wealth, and a number of these other factors, when food is not accessible and affordable, that throughout history, at least, we have seen civilizations fall, right? I lean toward that we will continue to evolve, that we will honor the voices that come from so many different people, that we will continue to evolve in the science and in the technology space, and that we will be able to address and deal with the impacts that are happening and are going to continue to happen in the climate crisis. That does not mean that there will not be challenges in that space. But I'm one who believes that as we come together, we can actually deal with the challenges. That's my optimistic view that I believe is possible, revitalizing vulnerable communities, moving from surviving to thriving. What does that look like? It looks a lot like that future, where folks are not at the end of a policy process, but at the beginning, where their voices are honored, their innovation and ingenuity is honored, that they don't just have a seat at the table, but they're framing out the direction that we're going in. It looks like projects that I've worked on, like the Regenesis project in Spartanburg, South Carolina. I would implore everyone to go and look at that project, and I can give you a list of others, where they took a $20,000 environmental justice small grant, a program that the last administration tried to get rid of, and leveraged it into $300 million in changes in their community and in community centered, and built 144 partners. They've got new housing, new transportation routes. They've got new medical facilities. The community went through worker training programs, and they helped to rebuild their community. They got folks engaged in the civic process, so forth and so on. I share all that to say that whether we're looking at ocean policy, we're looking at some of our shoreline policy, if we're looking at some of the impacts that are happening in Appalachia, in the Rust Belt, on the Gulf Coast, in the breadbasket, that we have examples of how real change can happen. We have to just have the resources that will help those projects to be successful. We have to build the right frameworks of getting and helping partners to understand how they can be authentic in that space. And then, folks will make it happen. We just got to give folks the space. We got to make sure that the science is in there, that we're looking at our laws, and that we are looking for opportunities to make our laws more inclusive and filling the gaps that exist. We have the ability to do this. Dr. King shared with us, and folks have heard me both in this country and across the planet when I speak. And sometimes it's amazing how many people who knew who Dr. King was, even in other countries around the world. Dr. King said that we come to these shores in different ships, but we're all in the same boat now. Imagine if we realize that we're in the same boat, that when we honor Mother Earth, which is the first principle of the environmental justice movement, but that when we look at the pandemic that we're currently dealing with, if we all realize that we're all in it and that we can all get through it, if we pull together, we would have had a different set of responses and we'd be in a different place right now. If we realize that we were all in the same boat in relationship to systemic racism, because the ripples hit everybody. They hit people of color, of course, differently and more intensely, but it affects everyone. It affects our economy. It affects our public health system. It affects so many different things. And climate change. I mean, nothing is more apparent that we're all in the same boat. Yes, communities of color are hit first and worst, but we can flip this and say, we're in the same boat. How do we put together these sets of opportunities, these structures, these new paradigms, these 21st century paradigms that prepare us both on the adaptation and the resiliency side, but thinking even broader than that construct of how do we remake our country and how do we help that to then help to better protect our planet is where we got to be. That's the work that I try and do. with revitalization strategies and others. I never take credit for that I have this super creative concept. I just have been blessed to have some, some privilege and some platforms to get folks to hear a couple words. And then I just use it to try and connect people and then hopefully take it to the next level. So I'm looking forward to working with so many additional incredible scientists and getting all my friends over at NASA. Yes, shout out to NASA. Also better connected. So I know the future is bright. We just got to grab hold of it. We should be the 21st century North Star.
Well, on that note, while I wish we had many more hours for discussion, I think that is a wonderful, beautiful place to stop today. And I just want to extend my thank you for you spending the time with us today in conversation. I've certainly learned a lot, and I will pass it to Dr. Mata.
Just want to say thank you again, and thanks to everybody who joined us, and stay safe, be well, and enjoy hopefully the springtime weather where everybody's coming from. Bye, everyone.
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.